In this lecture, let's go ahead and let's try to create or use state in a class-based component. So right now we won't be using state in a functional component because that requires us the use of hooks, and we have not yet learned the concept of hooks. So let's first start off with using state in a class-based component. So even before doing that, you actually need to fix an error which we had in the previous lecture, and that is we have tried to access the props here and change it. So simply delete that, and once you are done with this, you're pretty much good to go. So in order to understand the concept of state, we will be creating a counter variable and displaying the value of count here, and we will try to change the value of that counter variable. So let's go ahead and quickly do that. So I would create a brand new component in order to avoid confusion. So I'll create a new file and let's call this thing as counter.js, and this is going to be a class-based component. So I would say class counter extends, that's going to be component from React. So it's automatically imported up over here. And as with every class-based component, we have a render method, and this render method is now going to return some JSX code. So let's say I use the h3 tag and I would say count value is, and right now let's keep this thing as empty. And finally, let's also export this component as well. So export default counter. So once we do that, let's import that component up over here. So import counter from components/counter, and let's delete the profile component from here, and instead let's use the counter component. So we won't be using props here, so we don't need to pass any attributes over here. Now the thing is, let's go to the counter.js. Let's check if we get that over here, and yeah, we do get that. And now let's say I want to use some sort of a variable here to hold the actual count value. So in order to hold that value, what I would do is that I would create a state here inside the counter component. Now to use or create state in a component, first of all, we need to create a state object, because just like a prop, a state is also an object. Now to create the state object inside the class counter, we need to use a constructor. So what is a constructor? If you understand the concept of object-oriented programming, you already know that whenever you create an instance of a class or an object of a class, we use a constructor to initialize certain values. So let's go ahead and create a constructor for this particular class counter here. So in order to create a constructor in JavaScript, you simply say constructor. So this is nothing but it's simply like a simple method. And whenever you create a constructor, you also need to go ahead and call the super method. And the reason why you need to call this super method is that as we are extending from the component class, a call has to be made to the base class constructor. So this component also has a constructor which is going to be the base class constructor. So this is the base class here. And whenever you are using a constructor inside this class, you also need to make a call to the constructor of this class as well. And in order to make a call to this class's constructor, we make use of the super method in there. So this is why we have this code here. And now finally, we could go ahead and create a state object in here. So in order to create that specific state object, I need to say this dot state, and then I need to set its value. Now, as this is an object, I'll make use of curly brackets here. So for now, let's say the state value is set to absolutely empty. So right now we don't have any property in this state. But now we actually want to add a counter which holds a specific value. So in order to do that, I would go right inside the state object and I would say counter, and I would set its value to, let's say, 0. So once I do that, now we have our own state defined here. So these are all the things which you actually need to perform whenever you simply have to create a state inside a class component. So after creating the class, you need to create a constructor. After creating a constructor, you need to call the super method. And after calling the super method, in order to set the value for state, you have to access the state using the this keyword. You need to say this dot state use curly brackets as this is an object. Always remember that state and props are objects. They are not simple variables which you could use. Therefore, we make use of curly brackets here. And then we set the counter property of that state to 0. So now once we have defined this particular property, I could finally make use of that particular state over here. So here I could simply make use of curly brackets, and in order to access state, I would say this dot state. And in order to actually access the counter value, I say dot counter. So if I do that now, if I go back to the browser, as you can see, it says that the count value is 0. Now let's say if I want to increment the value of this particular variable, which is the counter, how exactly would we do that? Let's say we want to have a button here, and whenever I click that particular button, the value of this count should go up. So let's try to add a button up over here. So I would go right here and I would try to add a button, and let's see what happens. So I would say button here and I would say click. So as soon as I add this line of code here, I will encounter an error. If I go back here, as you can see, it will get an error over here. And we get this error because whenever we are making a function or whenever we are making a particular component return some JSX, we always need to ensure that that JSX is enclosed inside a single HTML element. So if I hover over this, it says that JSX expression must have one parent element. So that means whenever you return some JSX, there should be only one parent element, and right now there are two parent elements. One is the heading and another one is button. So in order to resolve this issue, I would actually make use of parentheses here, and then I will create a div here and I will close that div here. So now this div actually becomes our parent element, and within this parent element we could have as many number of children as we want. So now I would cut this code, paste it in here inside the parent element, and now you no longer have an error because now this div acts as the parent element for our JSX, and these actually become their children. So right now we only have one parent element here, and that's exactly what we want. So now if I save this and if I go back here, as you can see, we now have this button over here. Now our next job is to go ahead and make this button functional. So we are going to learn how to do that in the upcoming lecture. So thank you very much for watching, and I'll see you guys in the next one. Thank you.